I worked fall seasons in Grand Teton National Park long enough to know the rhythm of the valley. In September, the days stayed cold in the mornings, the air thin and clean, and the sound that defined the month carried easily through the canyons. The high-rising call of bull elk bugling for cows and for rank. Visitors often thought it sounded like something human in distress. We explained that it was normal, that the rut made all kinds of noises. I had given that talk dozens of times at trailheads and pull-outs. I knew the timing of when the herds moved between meadows, where they crossed Teton Park Road after dusk, and which drainages drew the biggest bulls. I trusted that knowledge, and I trusted the species that shared the valley with us: elk, moose, black bears, the few grizzlies that traveled down from the north, wolves in small packs, and the cougars that kept the timberbird slopes and moved mostly at night. I also understood how we wrote reports. When the cause of death was unclear, we found a place to file it that would not confuse the public. You do that long enough, and you begin to believe it is always enough. Then a call comes in that unsettles what you think you know. Dispatch radioed me just after 9 on a clear night in late September. The message was short. Group of hikers reporting unusual animal noises near String Lake, possibly an injured elk in the water. I keyed my mic, confirmed I was 10 minutes out, and turned up the road. I remember the drive because it was one of those nights when the sky looked hard and the mountains cut a perfect outline against it. The parking lot at String Lake was almost empty. Just a rental SUV and a compact car with a university sticker in the back window. 4 hikers waited by the bear box. They were young, Idaho plates on the compact, pale faces and wide eyes. One of them kept his hands on the lid of the bear box as if he needed the steel under his palms to stay upright. They all tried to talk at once. I asked for names and then for the basic facts: where, when, what they heard. They had been on the loop around the lake, walking clockwise, and were on the west shoreline when they stopped to listen to bugles coming off the slopes. They said everything seemed normal until a long high scream came across the water, not a bugle. One of them insisted. Higher, longer. I asked if they had seen anything. They said yes, something thrashing out in the shallows near the north inlet. They thought it was a bull elk because they had seen antlers glint in their headlamps. Then the screaming changed pitch, and one of them said he heard a sound like something heavy hitting water. After that, only ripples. I told them to wait by their car. I signed out a radio check with dispatch and started up the trail with a flashlight and my duty belt. The east side of String Lake lay quiet. Had lamplight made a clean cone through the air. Each step along the shoreline brought the smell of cold water and damp duff. Across the lake, the dark mass of Mount Moran hid most of the horizon, and along the west bank, the spruce and fir stood tight to the waterline. I followed the loop north, pausing every few minutes to listen. I heard the normal late season night sounds: water licking at stones, the occasional clack of a branch settling, the distant whistle of a bull toward the lake that rose and broke in the familiar pattern. I kept going. At the north end, the lake narrows to the inlet where a shallow stream feeds down from Lee. The trail there runs so close to the water that you can kneel and touch the lake. I aimed my light across a fringe of reeds, then another few yards down the shoreline. The first thing I noticed was the shape: a broad shoulder and rib cage just under the surface, hair floating in a pale skirt around it. Then the tines caught the light, white and slick. I stepped closer and saw a bull elk lying on its side in water, not even to my knees, had half submerged, one eye open and dull, tongue showing between the teeth. The rack was substantial, 6 points on one side, 7 on the other, with the kind of palmation you see in older bulls. The odd thing was the orientation. The main beams were not swept forward in the normal arc. They were driven backward toward the skull as if the entire rack had been forced in reverse until the bases were flexed against the bone that should have anchored them upright. I checked for a second animal. Another bull could have locked antlers with him and drowned him during a fight. That happened some years, and we find the bodies tangled together. I scanned the water and shoreline. Nothing. I looked for sign tracks in the mud, blood, hair. The mud was kicked up. The reeds flattened in a broad circle, and the water beyond was clouded with silt. But there was no second body, no trail of blood leading away, no clear set of prints consistent with a bear dragging a kill. If it had been a grizzly, or even a black bear, I expected the neck to be mauled and the body torn open at the flank. This body was intact. If it had been wolves, there would be multiple bite marks on the hind quarters and maybe a hamstring. I saw none of that. The only injuries besides the strain where the antlers met the skull were abrasions on the shoulders and hips that could have come from thrashing in the shallows. I radioed in the find, gave GPS coordinates from the unit on my belt, and asked for wildlife staff at First Light. By the time I finished with the initial notes and a quick set of photographs, the hikers had driven off. I stayed until midnight. The lake made small sounds around me, and somewhere up the slope, a bull worked his voice into a thin, broken bugle that echoed over the water. It sounded ordinary and did nothing to explain why the animal at my feet lay with its crown forced backward like a lever had been pressed against it. We did the removal the next morning. 2 of our wildlife techs and a biologist met me at the lot. We ran the usual checks: sex, age estimate from tooth wear, body condition. The biologist believed the bull had been in a fight and pushed into the shallows where the weight of the rack and struggling in the water created a torque that damaged the pedicles and forced the antlers backward. He marked the cause of death as trauma sustained during rooting activity. I wrote my incident report to match. It was clean. It made sense on paper, and it kept the file from turning into a question that would require more work than we had time for that week. I did not include the hiker's description of the sound beyond the phrase unusual vocalization. I did not write what I myself had heard at the start of the call out because I could not find a neutral way to describe it without sounding like I had confused an elk with a person. That night, the valley was active. Bugles came from the meadows near Jenny Lake and from the timber above Lee Lake. We had the usual radio chatter about tourists too close to bulls, a cowherd crossing the road, and a small black bear near a picnic area that needed to be hazed back into cover. For a few hours, I forgot about String Lake. Then around 11, I heard a note in the call that did not resolve the way it should. Elk bugles are a narrow whistle that rises, sometimes breaks into a series of grunts or a chuckle. This one climbed high and just stayed there like a steady pressure that did not need to breathe. It seemed to come across water. Though I was not near String Lake at that moment, I told myself it was distance and echo. I had to tell myself something, or I would not do my job in a way that kept other people safe. Over the next 2 weeks, a few more visitors mentioned noises at night along the trail that connects String to Lee. None of them had recordings. They used the same words: high, long, too steady. I checked the shoreline several times and found nothing but tracks in the soft ground where elk had come down to drink. I stood more than once with my light off and listened to the far shore, waiting for a clean bugle to wash the idea out of my head. On most nights, that worked. A few nights it did not. When work slowed, I went to the records room. Every park holds a century of its own memory in paper boxes. I pulled incident logs, not because I thought I would find something definitive, but because I needed to feel like I was doing anything besides waiting for a noise. Old files carry the same language we use now: unknown trauma, injury sustained during seasonal behavior, predation suspected. Teton records from the late 70s listed a handful of early winter elk carcasses along creek margins with no clear predation marks. Yellowstone had a few more, not surprising for the size of the herds there, with side notes about unusual call reported prior to discovery. None named String Lake. None mentioned antlers forced backward. Still, seeing the pattern of vague notes took the edge off my doubt. There is comfort in paperwork. It implies boundaries. I asked one of the senior rangers about older stories from the valley. He had worked winters running elk management near the National Elk Refuge and summers patrolling backcountry zones up past Mare. He shrugged and said people have always heard things they do and have a name for around water at night. He mentioned that long before the park, the valley had been a travel corridor for many tribes, and that some families he talked to growing up in Wyoming didn't fish or hunt late at night along certain lakes. He didn't say why. He didn't claim any link to what I had heard. He just said it in a way that asked me to treat the idea with respect, even if I couldn't file it in a category I understood. One evening, I went back to String Lake alone, parking just before sunset and walking the loop counterclockwise. The water lay flat, and as the light drained out of the canyon, the surface turned dark and took on the color of the sky. I stopped near the inlet where we had found the bull. A heron stood in the shallows and watched the current in that patient way they have. I waited until full dark. Far off up near Lee, a bull started to bugle. The call rose and fell as expected, and then the next one did the same, and then the next. I breathed easier and almost turned for the lot. That was when a longer note came from the same direction and held. No break, no chuckle, no breath. It sat on one thin line of pitch. I felt it in my teeth before I understood I was hearing it. The heron flapped once and lifted away. I did not move. The sound ended suddenly, and in the small wake that followed, I realized I had my light clenched in my hand, but hadn't turned it on. I did not go looking for a body. I am not ashamed to say that. I clicked my radio once without transmitting just to hear it respond. Then I walked back along the shore in a steady, careful way and signed off when I reached the lot. There was nothing to report that would change a policy or alert a visitor. There was only the fact that I had heard something again that did not belong to the patterns I knew and that it had come across water. Years have passed since that season. I have worked other parks and other jobs, and I have seen plenty of ordinary harm done to elk by the things we can name. Cars, wolves, late snow, deep ice, the blind force of rut. I have rolled bulls over to look for the blood mat where the predator started, and I have listened to calves call for their cows and then fall quiet. I accept the way those parts fit. When I think back to the String Lake bull, I picture the way the antlers pressed backward against the bases. All that weight forced the wrong way by some combination of leverage and panic that left no clear tracks. I can hear the hikers trying to describe what they heard and how uneasy they were about putting human words to it. And I can hear myself choosing the language that would fit the file. Every September, if I am anywhere near mountain country, I make a point to stand outside at night when the air turns cold and the elk start to sound off. I listen for the clean rise and fall I learn to trust. Most nights, that is what I hear. Now and then there is a note that climbs a little higher and seems to hold just a fraction too long. It always ends where it should, and I tell myself it was echo or wind or the shape of the land. That is what experience is for, giving yourself reasons to keep moving through your work and through the places you care about. But I have not stood again on the edge of String Lake at night and waited for an answer. The report we filed that morning still sits in the system marked as trauma from rooting combat. It is a reasonable line. It keeps the shelves neat. I am the one who cannot make it explain the sound that brought me there or the way a crown of bone can be forced back against what should hold it fast, with nothing else on that shore to take the blame. I am writing this because it was my first real case that went cold and because I still run my thumb over the radio scar on my shoulder when I tried to sleep. I was new to search and rescue then, still learning the difference between a seasoned hiker and a fool with nice boots. The case was in Great Smoky Mountains National Park out of the Elkmont area. The missing man was named Alistair Finch, retired engineer, quiet, organized, the kind who logged miles and weather in a spiral notebook. He came here every autumn for a solo loop and always told his wife the date he'd be out. She called when he was 2 days overdue. That alone set the tone. People like Finch don't waste time. They don't change routes on a whim. They don't disappear for fun. We rolled into Elkmont just after sunrise. The parking area was damp from night mist. Leaves matted to the gravel like scales. His sedan sat where he said it would, locked, no sign of a struggle. One fast food receipt on the floorboard from Sevierville the morning he went in. The first team took Little River Trail. My team checked Jake's Creek trail up toward the old cottages. We did the usual, hailed his name at intervals, checked pullouts and social trails, scanned the water for clothing, watched for fresh boot tracks cutting across the duff. The day stayed bright and calm. By afternoon, the park had the command trailer set, and the incident commander divided us into hasty and grid teams. Docs came in by evening. No big storms on the forecast. It should have been straightforward day to step into that quiet terror that SAR people learned to recognize. We had coverage on the primary corridor and still nothing. We found the hikers who reported seeing a tall man hiking alone with a blue pack near the junction to Cucumber Gap. They were sure of the day and time. We flagged the sighting and pushed that direction. I remember feeling almost embarrassed at how hopeful I was. A sighting near Cucumber Gap narrows your world in a good way. It gives you a map corner to press at. The third morning around 10, Team 3 radio to find secondary markers branching off above Little River near where an old rail grade splits. They describe small rock stacks and saplings bent in the same direction every 50 or 60 feet. It wasn't the paint you see on official trees, but it looked like a maintained route. The spacing was clean. It guided around wet gullies and slabby roots. Inexperienced eyes would call it a perfect shortcut. Our lead, 30 years in the Smokies, name's Mitch, made the call to shift resources. If Finch had taken that branch, we were tracking him, not guessing. We spread out, but kept the rock stacks in view. The air felt different in there. Rhododendron pressed in and then opened like doors over and over. The ground was soft and forgiving. If Finch had put a foot wrong, we would have seen a slide of damp soil or torn moss. We saw none. In fact, the pathway looked groomed. Each time the grade steepened, the bent saplings set an angle that smoothed it out. It was like following a thought that someone else had already finished. After an hour, the markers curved us back the way we came, then turned us again and started climbing. The double back was subtle. You don't expect a handmade route to waste energy. I told myself maybe whoever made it wanted to avoid a washed out section. We kept our spacing, called out the distance to the next stack, checked our bearings. The elevation gain was steady and careful, never more than 100 feet without a reprieve. Whoever laid that path knew hikers, their pace, their lungs, their patience. Near the top of the ridge at a poplar that had survived a lightning scar, we found the blue pack. It stood up right against the trunk. Straps buckled and tightened as if waiting for a back. On a flat rock beside it sat a metal water bottle and a compass. I touched nothing until the scene was photographed and flagged. The bottle had condensation and leaf grid on the bottom. The compass face was clean. Both items felt staged in the most infuriating way. Too tidy, too presentable, like a hotel tray. We called in the find. Mitch came up and squatted by the pack for a long minute. He set this down without stress. He said, "No tearing, no drop marks." He looked at the path ahead and then at the ground near our boots. "Keep your eyes on the surface. Don't trust anything you can't measure." 30 yards past the poplar, the path ended. Not in a tangle or in blowdowns, not in a thicket. It stopped. One step we had clear leaf duff framed by canaries. The next step was air. A rock face dropped away. A vertical fall into green. The canopy below hid the base like a lid. I crawled on my stomach to the edge and looked over. The cliff face was clean and sheer, broken only by a few ledges where ferns had stolen purchase. There were no fresh scrapes in the lichen near the lip, no torn cloth on the bark, no broken branch below that could match a body clearing space on the way down. I swallowed and backed away. We fixed anchors and rappelled. We ran the face in sections with 2 lines, checked each ledge, marked the spots, checked again. At the bottom, we set a perimeter and fanned out. The slope dropped toward the river, steep with damp leaves that slid underfoot and gave you that slow motion panic where every step becomes a question. We searched until full dark and marked our last positions. Helicopter did a pass the next morning when the fog lifted. Dogs worked the drainages. Nothing. Back on the ridge, Mitch told us to backtrack and take down every single rock stack we had followed. He wanted to understand the pattern, not just erase it. If it's a prank, he said, it's not a funny one. If it's not a prank, we need to know how it thinks. We started dismantling from the top down. Each stack was maybe 6 or 7 stones high. No mortar. No unusual features. At the third one I took apart, I found something beneath the base. A flat rectangle the size of a playing card painted on one side. I lifted it and realized it was an official trailblaze, the kind that gets nailed to trees at junctions. The nail holes were bent and oval from being pried off. The painted face was scuffed, but still showed white. Someone had pulled it from a tree and laid it flat under the bottom rock where no hiker would see it. We found 2 more like that farther down. Same story, official markers removed, false ones built right on top. The more stacks we took down, the angrier Mitch got. He stopped talking much, he just kept moving. And every time he squatted and lifted that base stone and found bare dirt instead of metal, you could almost feel the relief in his shoulders. When he found another blaze, he would place it on his thigh, flatten it with his palm, and set it on the ground beside him like he didn't trust it to lie still. That evening, we made camp at the junction of Jake's Creek and Cucumber Gap. There's an old chimney there, and the creek runs with that steady rushing that makes you feel you can hear your own blood. Mitch turned to me and asked what I knew about the land before it was a park. I gave the textbook version. Logging outfits, company towns, the old resort, then federal buyouts in the 30s. He nodded and said he'd been here long enough to hear the other version. Families handed a check and told to move. Families who buried their dead up hollers the park now calls resources. Families who changed names and addresses and didn't move far. I told him I didn't truck much in campfire talk. He said he didn't either. Then he looked at the ridge line. But sometimes a story explains a thing better than a map does. We ran that search for 5 days. We covered both sides of that cliff, both drainages, and the flats along Little River. We checked the water as far as we could without risking people. The dogs got interested once near a side gully, then lost it. We pulled the case data together and it read like a malicious math problem. A recognized solo hiker takes a marked route that turns into a handmade path that leads him to a drop. He leaves his pack, water, and compass 20 yards before the edge. He vanishes. There are no signs of a fight, no signs of a fall, and no sign of him walking out. You don't get to decide how a missing person file ends. The file decides. This one ended with unresolved. We made a report to law enforcement. Rangers documented the altered markers and the removed blazes. The park rechecked official signage along those junctions. We pulled down anything that was in ours and cut the bent saplings so there'd be no argument later. I carried one of the pried-off blazes in my cargo pocket the rest of that week. It made a rectangle on my thigh that arced when I climbed. On the last day, we met with Finch's wife by the command trailer. She was small and neat and spoke with a kind of steady patience that makes everyone around her behave better. She thanked us each by name. She asked to see the place where we had found the pack. Mitch said no. It was the right call. I hated it. Before she left, she asked one question. Do you think he just lost his way? No one spoke? Mitch took a heartbeat longer than I thought he would and said, Ma'am, I don't think he got lost. I think he was led. I kept working in those mountains. Cases pass through you the way weather does. You get wet, you dry off, you put the same jacket on the next morning. But I carried the Finch case like you carry a tool, not a wound. When we train new volunteers, I used it to explain why you never trust an unofficial mark. Chirons can be helpful in a blowdown or on open rock. They can also be used the way barbed wire is used quietly, without warning, and exactly where it will cost you the most. 2 months later, I went back to that ridge with a maintenance crew. We followed what remained of the false route, more out of caution than curiosity, and destroyed the rest. We cut the bends in the saplings low and clean so they would keep pointing the wrong way as they healed. We packed out any stacked stones we found close to the lip and spread them far enough that even a cautious hiker wouldn't mistake them. I took the lead and stayed 10 feet back from any drop. At the poplar, the bark still held the shape of a pack against it if you knew how to see such a shape. Not because it was imprinted, but because my mind was already drawing around the absence. We found no fresh work, no new stacks, no prints. That should have helped. It didn't. There's a sentence our people say that sounds like a platitude until you live it. The land is neutral. It doesn't want you. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't think. What I saw on that ridge changed the way I used that sentence. The land may be neutral, but people aren't. And some people know how to make the land participate. If you take down official guidance and replace it with something that looks smarter, cleaner, kinder, you can make a good person walk exactly where you want them to. A year passed. I had other searches. I stopped waking up at night thinking I heard my radio. Then in late October, a backpacker reported strange markers east of Elkmont, near an old grade above Little River. He did the right thing. Took a waypoint from the junction sign and followed only established routes back out. He told a ranger at Sugar Lands. The report hit my desk the next day. I went in with two others. We moved slow. The markers looked like cousins to what we'd found before. Clean stacks, evenly spaced, saplings bent with care. Only this time, the path tried to pull you north toward a bench that finished in shale and bad footing. Not a cliff, but enough to break a leg. We took them down one by one and found two more pried-off blazes beneath the base rocks. I wrote the location, wrapped the metal in cloth, and put it in my pack. My partner squatted, staring at the shallow hole where the blaze had been. He said, "This is patient work." I said nothing. "You want me to say we caught someone?" We didn't. "You want me to say we found bones?" We didn't. What we did was change our rules. We posted new signs at Elkmont and at the junctions off Jake's Creek and Little River. Stay on established routes. Report any unmarked markers. Do not follow stacked rocks. We briefed every seasonal hire with photos and a simple policy: if it's not ours, take it down. We extended patrols in the shoulder season when the woods go quiet and people like Finch come for clear air and long views. The satisfying part, if there is one, came a year after that when I ran into Finch's wife again at a community talk at the visitor center. The ranger giving the talk mentioned trail safety and the changes near Elkmont. She listened from the back row. Afterward, she came up to me and asked if we'd made those changes because of her husband. I told her yes. I told her exactly what we had found beneath those rocks. I told her we did not find him and that I didn't think he left on his own defeat. I didn't tell her that the false path was beautiful. That word didn't belong anywhere near her. She held my gaze until it got uncomfortable. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me the truth," and put her palm on my forearm for a second. It was the first time I let myself call the case by its real name in my head. Not lost, not overdue, not missing, removed. I still work in the Smokies. I still love the quiet and the way the creeks decide your pace. When I train rookies, I start them at Elkmont and walk them up Jake's Creek and Little River. I say the names of the trails out loud like they are lines in a contract. I show them where a path can be shaped by hands that don't wish you well. We stop at a safe overlook and look toward a ridge we no longer use. I tell them about a pack against a poplar and a compass set just so on a rock. I tell them about blazes turned into bait. I tell them we took those stones apart and spread them so wide that they are just stones again. People think horror is loud. It isn't. It's orderly. It keeps time with your breath. It uses what you trust against you. I learned that here on a ridge above Little River in the quiet green light of afternoon. I learned that someone in these mountains knows exactly how to make a path that feels right for every step until there is no ground left to stand on. I learned to look twice at anything that tries too hard to help. I go back to that poplar once a year. I don't make a ceremony of it. I check the area stump to stump, and then I stand 10 feet back from the edge and take a plain minute. I don't ask for anything. I don't say anything. When I'm done, I walk out the right way along a route that tells the truth from the first turn to the last. And I let my boots do what they were made to do. Carry me past whatever someone else hoped I would not survive. I worked the swift current side of Glacier in 2007. I was a seasonal then, rotating between trail checks, backcountry permits, and whatever the station lead put on the board. The older lookouts were a regular part of the loop, even though they weren't staffed anymore. We inspected roofs, shutters, lightning grounds, and made sure no one had forced their way in. I liked the routine. The tower on Swift Current has a straightforward trail and a clean line of sight on a good day. On a bad day, the valley fills with fog and the ridges disappear in layers. That September, we had several of those days in a row. Near the end of my hitch, a front desk clerk from the hotel passed along a visitor report. A man seen waving from the tower windows near dusk. I've heard many versions of that kind of report, and most of them are nothing. People look up through weather and convince themselves of faces. Still, if a visitor says someone is up there, we check. I left from the Swift Current Ranger station late in the afternoon with a small pack, radio, extra batteries, first aid, a repair kit, a coil of cord, and a spare lock. I signed the trail register and started up. Visibility tightened as I climbed, like walking down a hallway that kept narrowing. The brush was wet, the tread damp, and the air had that cold that settles into hands and ears. I passed the usual spots, switchbacks with low stone walls, a short section across ground that holds snow well into summer. I saw no people and no sign of them. The log at the junction that day had one name before mine, a couple from the hotel who turned back when the weather moved in. It was a quiet trail otherwise, about 30 minutes below the tower. I stopped to drink and heard rock roll somewhere above me. A single scuff and then nothing. I counted out loud to 10, more to steady myself than anything else, then moved on. The lookout sits on a shoulder with a stone base and a small deck. When the fog is down, you see it only when you are nearly on it. The first thing I checked was the door. The park padlock was where it always is, dirty, but intact, stamped with our serial. The hasp was fine. The shutters were folded and pinned in place exactly as maintenance had left them before the summer. I walked the perimeter and saw immediately what wasn't fine. In the damp dirt and gritty sand that ringed the foundation, a set of fresh boot prints circled the building. They were sharp-edged and deep. The tread wasn't our current issue Vibram, but the pattern was close. An older style you still see on some hiking boots. I measured them quickly against my own, and they were a little longer, maybe by a half-inch. Whoever made them had weight on. The loop around the tower wasn't casual pacing. The steps were even and spaced like someone making a slow circuit to look out in every direction. I followed the prints where they left the perimeter. They led away on a slight downslope, careful and straight for about 50 yards. Then they crossed onto a run of bare rock that the tower sits on. At that point they stopped, on the rock. There was nothing to read, no gravel disturbed, no dust smear, no broken lichen. I hunted for a few minutes on hands and knees and came up with the same result. No return track, no diverging line, no drag. It was like someone walked to that point and then removed their feet from the ground without coming back down. I stood up and forced myself to think in checklists. If a person had been here, they had 3 choices: go back, go forward, or go sideways. The dirt showed no backtrack. The cliffside is too steep to step off without a mark or a fall, and there was no fall, not there. The upslope leads to more stone and then a patch of stunted shrubs. Those also showed nothing. I made a slow circle with the tower as my hub and kept coming back to the same 50-yard line with the same empty rock. With visibility dropping and night not far off, I logged a quick update on the radio that I'd reached the tower and found no person and that the structure was secured. I didn't mention the prints on the open channel. I did a last walk around the base to confirm nothing had changed in the few minutes I'd been away. The padlock still hung from the latch. The window shutters on the windward side rattled softly as the fog pushed against them. I stood at the corner, looked up through the gray at those windows, and felt that small pressure in the chest that makes you want to move without turning your back. I packed my light and started down. Back at the station, I wrote the basic note every patrol writes. Date, time out and in, weather, trail condition, wildlife sightings? I added, lookout secured. That would have been the end of it. Instead, after a shower and a reheat of the days left over chilly, I went into the small map room where we kept binders that never made it to the formal archive. Every station has them. They're where you find the parts of the job that don't fit the safe visit brochure. You get lightning strikes, close calls with grizzlies, lost hikers who weren't truly lost, and the stories older rangers passed down with a shrug. I took the Swift Current binder and started paging. Buried in notes from the 1960s forward, I found 4 entries that matched the same report almost word for word. In 1967, a family on the pass trail claimed a man waved from the tower during fog. In 1983, 2 men from Minnesota said they saw someone standing in the window at dusk and that the door looked closed. In 1991, a hotel employee hiking on a day off said a figure at the tower raised an arm and then wasn't there when she reached the summit. In 1999, a day hiker told a backcountry desk attendant about the guy in the window. Each note was short. None went into the incident system. Whoever wrote the margins added one common line. No entry at tower. A separate folder held old maintenance rosters for the lookout from the 1930s and early 1940s when it was staffed. A name showed up several times in 1941 and 1942. Thomas Braden, 22 at the time, listed as Firewatch. There was a 1-page memo clipped to his last entry. It said he failed to return from a supply haul before a storm and was presumed to have fallen between the pass and the tower. The memo referenced a search that turned up nothing and a conclusion that snow likely covered the site before it could be found. I took those notes home in my head and slept poorly. The next day, we had morning tasks, but the weather wasn't improving, and the forecast kept the fog in place through the evening. I told myself I'd hike back up after shift to be certain no one had slipped the lock, to document the prints in better light, and to rule out the one thing hadn't considered that I'd misread the ground, because I wanted the night to be done. I left again with the same pack, an extra layer, and a second headlamp. I didn't tell anyone I was going for a second look. It wasn't a secret. It just didn't feel like something worth passing around until I had a cleaner explanation than tracks that ended on a rock. Climbing into fog a second time felt like walking back into a room where you'd had a bad conversation. Nothing had changed, and yet you're alert to every sound. The trail was emptier than the night before. I made the top in just under the same time and stepped into the small cleared apron around the tower. The door was still locked, the lock unchanged. The circle of prints from the previous evening had softened, but hadn't vanished. I could still place my boot beside them and see which was fresher. Theirs were. I took out a small scale from the pack and set it near one of the best impressions to estimate length. Size 11, maybe 12. A few steps away, I heard soil compact, the slow, granular sound of weight finding purchase. I turned and saw a new print form about 8 feet from me. It hadn't been there a second before. It impressed the dirt like a slow press of a stamp. Another formed a pace beyond it, then another, making the same even circuit around the base. Nothing made them, no legs above them, no shadow, no trick of light, just the ground receiving pressure at regular intervals. I stood still and watched the full circle complete. The air was so dense I could only see 2 or 3 steps ahead of where the next one would appear. And then it was there, shaped and clear, edging past the corner where I had first found the loop the night before. I didn't speak. I didn't raise the radio. I could feel each step in the solace of my feet the way you feel a close footfall on a wooden floor. It finished where it began and stopped. The ground went quiet again, if you can call fog quiet. I walked to the nearest new impression and placed my boot beside it. Same size, same depth, same tread. I moved down the line where they left the tower and followed them exactly 50 yards to the same run of flat stone. The last new print sat with wet edges on the edge of the rock. Beyond that point, there was nothing. I went back to the tower and stood under the window on the leeward side. I looked up through the gray and saw a shape move behind the glass. Not a face, not a trick of cloud, but a clear shift of a person passing. It crossed, paused, and then an arm raised in a slow wave. It wasn't frantic. It was mechanical in the way people do something they've done many times before. I looked down at the lock in my hand and looked back up. The arm lowered, the shape moved away from the window. The tower above me was sealed. The hardware on the door told me no one had opened it in months. I felt the urge to climb the railing and shoulder the door, thus to force the question to an answer. Training overrode that urge. We don't break historic doors because of a feeling. I backed away a few steps and finally spoke into the radio. I said I was on site, weather poor, no hazards to structure, no persons observed outside, and that I'd be returning to base before full dark. I didn't describe the window or the prints. I put the radio away and listened for any human sound. Footsteps on wood, a cough, anything that would make me rethink the line I just broadcast. There was only the steady push of weather over the ridge and the occasional tap of moisture on metal. Before leaving, I made one last walk to the print on the edge of the rock and tried to think like a person trying to get off that platform without leaving a mark. If you jumped to a lower slab, there would be scarring in the lichens or a slip pattern. There was none. If you stepped onto a pad of snow, there would be a collapse in a hole. There was no snow on that line. If you traversed to a crack, there would be transfer. There was none I could see. I left the summit at a steady pace and didn't look back until I reached the switchbacks where the tower drops out of view. At the station, I wrote a second entry that was almost identical to the first. In my own notebook, the one not issued by the park, I wrote the date and a single sentence. Tracks formed around the tower with no person present. That night, I went back to the binder and read the notes again. In two of the older entries, there was a date in early September in 1942. The memo about Thomas Braden's disappearance was dated in the same week. I don't believe in patterns when the data set is this small, but I do believe in the way mountains keep their own schedules and draw people into repeating them. A young man climbed into weather and didn't come back. People looked up through that same kind of weather and thought they saw someone. Decades later, I stood under a locked window and watched a hand raise and lower. I didn't file anything formal about what I saw. There is no place in our system for prints with no person and movement in a sealed tower. The best I could have done was unverified visitor report, and even that would pull a follow-up from someone who would ask the right question. Did you confirm entry? I couldn't lie. I also didn't want the tower's hardware drilled out because I didn't hold my nerve. Instead, I told the next ranger on duty that if we got more of those hotel reports during fog, we should go in pairs and treat the footing around the tower like a live scene. Not because of a stranger, but because the ground plays tricks when you're trying to reconcile it with your eyes. In the years since, I've gone back to Glacier several times as a visitor, and once on a short contract. I've kept an ear out for the same report. It still comes in now and then, usually when the valleys are covered and the ridge is a gray line in a sky the same color. A hiker will point to the tower and say they saw someone. The padlock keeps doing its job. The shutters age another season. The dirt around the base holds what it's given and then lets it go when the next storm rolls through. I don't make more of it than that. I don't have to. For me, the story has a clean edge, a name in a roster, a failed return in 1942, and a piece of ground that sometimes behaves like it remembers. If you hike up there on a day like the ones I had, do what we ask on every trail. Keep your footing, watch the weather, and don't push your luck at dusk. If you think you see someone at the window, look twice and check the door before you make your mind up. If you find the prints, follow them to the rock and stop where they stop. You'll know the spot. You'll feel it in your feet the way I did, like weight set down and then lifted. That's where I chose to leave it. Not because I was scared of an answer, but because the answer I had was enough. Before I was a senior ranger, before gray outnumbered brown in my beard, I worked seasons in Big Bend National Park. It is a place that strips away comforts and leaves you with measurements. Air temperature, wind speed, gallons of water, miles to the truck, time until sundown. That is how I kept my job, by counting and writing things down. The account that follows is the most careful thing I have ever recorded. It concerns a canyon west of Chizo's Basin, a string of deaths that never fit the usual patterns, and what I did to make sure no one else ended up on a stretcher under that sun. The call came in on a July afternoon when the monitor read at Panther Junction. A family of 4 at a primitive site near the basin reported the father missing. His name was Mark Kellerman, an architect from Houston, 48 years old. Height and weight listed on the permit. No current medications. The dispatcher relayed the wife's statement in a steady voice. He had been sitting by the fire ring reading, had stood up with a faint smile, and said he could hear an ice cream truck playing Pop Goes the Weasel. He said it sounded like the one from his old street and that he was going to buy rocket pops for the kids. He walked away over a low ridge into scrub. The wife and children heard only sickas. We built the initial response with what we had available. To seasonals, the duty medic, and me, we carried 3-liter bladders and bottled water. On top of that, we left a note with dispatch for the sheriff. The search started at the campsite, where Mark S. chair was still angled toward a flat rock and his paperback lay face down. His prints were easy to pick up, mid-weight hiking boots, even depth, no stagger. They made a straight line toward the west over ground that usually forces people into curves around soul clumps and shallow cuts. He kept a heading as if he had a handrail. That unnerved me more than I said out loud. We followed for 4 miles into a box canyon with walls that run high and rough. There is no water there. There is no shade during the day except a strip that moves along the south wall around late afternoon. I have been in that canyon enough times to know the way it holds heat. The prince went to the center of a flat, dusty clearing and then stopped. In that clearing, he lay on his side, hands loose, eyes closed. The medic did what he could do. It was not much. The face was calm. That is not a lie told to comfort families. I took a photograph for the report, and the muscles are visibly relaxed. The examiner called it hyperthermia with dehydration. On paper, it fit the season. The wife answered my questions in short bursts. He had said the tune was off-key the way it had been on their street, like the belt in the truck motor had squeaked. He laughed when he said it. He had not seemed confused. He did not take a pack. He did not drink from the gallon jug beside the chair. Their children were 7 and 9. One of them asked where the truck had parked, meaning the ice cream truck, and that made the mother start crying again. Back at the office, the case should have passed into the stack we call sad and ordinary. Heat makes fast work of people in July, but the details would not settle. I kept thinking about that line of prints. People who are lost make loops, hesitate, turn back, rest in shade, try for higher ground. Mark walked like he had a place to be. I checked the map grid again and drew a straight edge from the campsite to the clearing. It was nearly a clean line. I pulled older incident logs for that area. I asked around in quiet ways about that canyon. The older hands had a look they give each other when someone asks a question they all have asked privately. A former backcountry ranger told me, "I don't like that slice of the range. Always feels like folks go there on purpose." He could not back that with data, but I wrote it down. I went to the archive room by myself. There is a set of metal drawer cabinets along the far wall with reports back to the 1930s. The lights are the old humming kind, and the files smell like paper that has lived through many summers. I pulled every recovery in a 5 meters radius of that canyon and read the narrative sections. Most were routine heat injury cases or rolled ankles. A few were strange. In 1962, a prospector named Elmer Stowe was recovered after his partner walked out for help. The partner said Elmer had heard a hymn from the rocks and ran off. He called it Amazing Grace. In 1988, a United States Geological Survey geologist, Dr. A. Aries Thorne, was found near the same clearing. His field notebook survived. The final pages switched tone from measurements to fixation. He wrote about a persistent low-frequency resonance that resolved into clear wave action as if standing at a shoreline. The last line is one sentence in a cramped hand. The sound is a siren's call, and I'm going to find the shore. I copied the exact wording into my own notes without commentary. I stopped reading for a minute and thought about the three sounds: a hymn, ocean waves, and an ice cream truck. None of those belong in that canyon. None of those were generic claims about voices or noise. Each was specific and personal. If that was true, then the canyon did not merely carry sound. It made sounds tuned to the listener's memory. There was no mechanism in any manual for that. I opened another drawer and pulled a folder marked with rancher correspondence from the 1930s. One line from a letter caught me. We avoid the singing cut west of the basin. It makes the mules stubborn and the men stupid. Men who write like that tend to be plain and not poetic. I put the letter back. I did not take this pattern to my supervisor. I knew how it would sound coming out of my mouth. I wrote a request to survey for endangered cacti along the western slope. It was approved because we were due to update habitat maps and because I am good at filling forms. I packed the truck with more water than I needed, 2 compasses, and a notebook. I did not bring a camera. I told no one where I was going beyond the general area noted on the form. The hike-in during daylight was routine. I parked off a service road and walked in along the low draws. Heat lay close to the ground. My boots sank into dust that holds a print like plaster. The canyon had the usual signs: a scatter of moo deer tracks on the east side where thin shade lasts longer, a few old beer cans that I picked up and bagged, and a coil of discarded wire that looked like it had fallen off a ranch truck years ago. Nothing strange presented itself. I took bearings every quarter mile and noted them. I ate a salted pack of almonds and drank half a liter. I did not feel watched or anything of that kind. If something there was dangerous, it acted by other means. I camped at the mouth of the canyon to keep the box walls at my back. I made a small controlled flame for boiling water and let it go out. It is better to keep the night simple. I lay back and watched a thin line of satellites move north to south. The air cooled enough to stop the heat shimmer off the rock. Sikas slowed down. When the sun dropped fully and the last brightness left the upper ledges, I heard a creak. At first, I did not place it. It was a wooden hinge sound, small and regular. It took a few cycles before my memory caught up, a porch swing. Then there was a voice, low and even, a woman humming. The tune was a lullaby my mother used on nights I had a fever. It has no words in my head, just the pattern. Hearing it in that canyon hurt in a way I had not expected. The sound was not coming from everywhere. It came from up canyon around a bend to the right. My legs moved on habit. I stood and took 2 steps before I understood I was already going without gear. I stopped, cursed at myself under my breath, and slid my pack on. The humming stayed steady. I walked. The path turned into the clearing where we had found Mark. The sound strengthened and sat at a fixed distance in front of me. Maybe 50 yards, just around a shallow turn. I felt sure that if I walked to that point, I would see a porch I recognized and the woman from my childhood, younger than when she died, sitting and rocking. This is not imagination woven from fear. I mean that my body prepared to greet a person from years ago. I put my hand on the rock beside me to slow myself and felt grains of dust grind under my palm. My light caught a metal edge in the ground 2 paces off the path. I knelt and brushed aside a thin layer of powder. It was a belt buckle oval with an engraved steer head. It looked like the sort of thing a man would have worn out there when I was a kid or earlier. 10 feet away lay a single hiking boot with cracked leather. The laces were gone. The toe cap was scuffed down to fabric. My light found farther on a plastic whistle stamped with a sports logo I did not recognize. None of those objects placed themselves as a shrine. They were scattered artifacts like the desert sometimes reveals after a wind, but they sat in a line that pointed where the lullaby was coming from. The humming did not falter or fade. It did not react to me at all. I took one more step and stopped again. I remembered the boot prints from Mark, a straight line as if following a string. My own steps were beginning another string. The porch creak kept time. I told myself to stand still for 60 seconds with the light off. I counted out loud under my breath to keep the time honest. At 30, I wanted to move. At 50, I felt my throat tighten. At 60, I turned the light back on, picked up the buckle, and put it in my pack. I said in a normal tone, "That's enough." My voice sounded like any other voice would sound outdoors. The humming continued. I turned and walked the other way. I made it as far as the mouth of the canyon at a fast hiking pace, then jogged the last quarter mile to the truck. It was not a disciplined run. I caught my shin on a low rock. I banged my shoulder into the door frame getting in. I sat there with the keys in my fist until my breathing came down. The porch sound was not audible at the truck. No sound carried to the road at all. I drove back to quarters and went to the sink and ran the tap and drank until the water went from cool to warm. I slept in my boots and woke up twice in the dark. When I woke, the lullaby ran in my head with complete clarity, and I understood we had not been dealing with men who lost their way because of poor judgment. We had been dealing with men who were led past their judgment by something that reached through memory. I did not put any of that in a memo. I wrote a different report. It took me a week to build it in a way that would hold. I wrote about microseismic instability along a fault trace. I cited a study on gas emissions from deep fissures and noted that hydrogen sulfide could accumulate in low areas. I mapped fracture patterns that do not exist. I attached a risk matrix with boxes shaded red. I recommended closure of 5 square miles around the canyon for public safety until a structural geology team could complete a full assessment. I submitted it with my name at the bottom. I had a reputation for being practical and dull on paper. That helped. There were meetings. A regional officer asked if we had any alternative to full closure. I said partial closures invite workarounds and missing signs. An interpretation lead asked how long the closure would run. I said indefinitely, pending funds that we did not have. A superintendent who liked me signed the order. We had the fabricators make signs with the strongest legal language. We posted those signs. We fenced the most obvious approach lines and erased the canyon from brochures. The press release that went out used the phrases I had provided. It said nothing about a tune you could not stop following. After that, my work was routine again, but for one addition. I checked the western boundary lines more often than anyone else. When signs were shot through or bent, I replaced them. When a social trail started to feather in through creosote, I brushed it out. When a hiker asked why an area was closed, I gave the printed reason and offered other routes. It became a quiet habit to pause near the last fence line and listen. I did not hear anything from that canyon again. It does not matter whether that was because there was nothing to hear or because I stayed far enough away. Years went by. I moved from seasonal to permanent, took on training new staff and answered questions from visitors about the best sunrise pullouts. On the anniversary of the Kellerman recovery, I signed out the evidence box and looked at the photographs again. The line of print still ran straight as string. The face still looked calm. I put the photos back and signed the box in. I did not reopen Dr. Thorne's field notes. I had copied what mattered into my private notebook, and I knew the last line by heart anyway. 15 years after the closure, I prepared to retire. On a cool winter morning, I drove out to the western boundary with a new aluminum sign in the cab. The old one had been bent by wind or truck bumper. It is hard to tell which. I carried a post driver and 2 posts. I set them in a line with the others in cans of sorts. When I lifted the driver and dropped it over the top, the sound came up through my arms the way it always has when steel meets steel. Coyotes yipped south of me and fell quiet. I worked until the sign was tight and the wire snug. I wrote the date on the back in permanent marker. Back at the office, I put a thin ledger into the safe with a short note taped to it. The ledger holds my full account with names, dates, and the few objects I found that night. I do not expect anyone to read it. It is there because fences fall and people are curious, and the desert keeps its own calendar. If a future ranger has to decide what to do with that canyon, I want one honest record at hand. There is a satisfaction in finishing a job that protects people, even when the method feels crooked. I do not like that I had to lie on official letterhead. I do like that no father has walked past his children toward that flat spot since the closure went in. When someone asks me why that area is off limits, I say ground instability and gases. When someone asks me what I remember most from my early years, I say heat advisories and long drives and the lesson that distance is not neutral. When I am alone near the boundary, I listen for what is not there. I do not want to hear anything. I prefer the empty air and the sound of the truck cooling down. You come to understand that some work is not about solving a mystery. It is about containing it so that people who do not know it exists never have to learn the hard way. I will hand in my badge at the end of the month. The signs will still stand, the maps will still show a blank space, and the canyon will wait behind its fence. I do not need to step into it again to confirm anything. I know what I heard once, and I know what I almost did. I lock the safe, check the back door, and drive home with the window cracked. The radio stays off, the road hum is enough.